Welcome back to another episode in the Beyond Addiction series. We started a two-part sub-journey in this series with our last lecture, in which we looked at the healthy brain and how it functions, and that was made as our standard, understanding how the brain ought to work, so that we can go on to this topic right here today, which I've entitled Chain Reaction, Understanding Addiction Part 2, How the Addicted Brain Works. To be more precise, we're going to look in detail at the neurobiology of addiction. We're going to understand how the chemical reactions inside of the brain, in the healthy brain, go wrong when we start influencing them with various chemical substances to create the sensation of pleasure. Now, the bottom line is this. All drugs that we take that create a high, that create euphoria, work on basically one of three principles or a cocktail of the following three principles. Notice also that in terms of this example, we're only using the dopamine system, that neurotransmitter you'll remember from our last session, only the dopamine system as the example. The drug interaction, well, that affects many different systems, many different neurotransmitter systems, and so because of the complexity involved, we're just going to use dopamine. You can extrapolate these principles to affect the serotonin system and the endorphin system and so on and so forth. So here we go. One of three principles of action to create the euphoria, to create the high that the drug user experiences when they take their drug. Principle number one is the overstimulation of dopamine release. Too much dopamine is released at one point in time. It floods the synapse. All of those receptors are getting the message to react. As one molecule is released, another quickly takes its place. There's never a time to relax. Strong, frequent messages from these chemical transmitters to the postsynaptic neuron saying, hey, get excited, it's firing time. Second principle of action is the inhibition of dopamine reuptake. What does that mean? Remember that recycling story we spoke about? Remember how the brain takes the dopamine and the other neurotransmitters, uses them, takes them out for a drive out of the garage, parks them in the parking bay, and then recycles them when they've done their work, parks them back in the garage, back in their little vesicle for later use? Well, some drugs will stop the recycling process. So as dopamine is gradually released or released at a slightly faster pace than normal, that dopamine cannot be removed from the synapse through the recycling channel, and so too much dopamine accumulates in the synapse. So the mechanism of action is different, principle 1 and principle 2, but the net overall effect is identical. You end up with too much dopamine in the synapse, overstimulation of the postsynaptic neuron, which is firing like mad, and thus the sensation of euphoria and drug high is created. Third principle of action is that some drugs will actually imitate dopamine. They will come into the synapse and they will bind to the same receptors that dopamine binds to, and they will thus trick the postsynaptic neurons into thinking there's lots of dopamine, so we must be excited and we must fire like mad. So we either overstimulate the dopamine release, we inhibit the reuptake of dopamine, or some drugs will imitate dopamine in the synapse itself. So let's have a look here under normal conditions, and what we're doing here is we are simply summarizing what we learned in our previous session. We're looking at the normal brain first. Normal conditions, we get moderate firing of a presynaptic neuron, release of a moderate amount of dopamine, binds to the receptors of the postsynaptic neuron, causing moderate firing of the postsynaptic neuron. Then we recycle that dopamine, park it back in its vesicle for later use. Now we're going to take a drug quickly. We're going to explore principle number 1, which is the overstimulation of dopamine. And to do this, we're going to use a drug from the amphetamine family. So amphetamine, which is known as speed or methamphetamine, which is known in South Africa as tik and in other countries by many different names, meth or crystal or whatever it is. And now we're going to take this drug and watch what happens on your screen. We ingest the drug, massive amount of dopamine released at one time. We've got so much in the dopamine that there's not even enough receptors. Very fast firing of the postsynaptic neuron. So it's like this. Imagine that we equate the normally firing postsynaptic dopamine-using neuron as walking. It's going along at walking pace. Now we take an amphetamine. We release all this dopamine. There's overstimulation. It gets excited. And now it starts running. It's not walking anymore. It's sprinting. Now it can do this for a little while. Just like you can walk long distances, but you will not be able to run long distances, as in sprint long distances. Even marathon runners do not sprint long distances. The guys that do sprinting races, we're talking about 100 meters or 400 meters, but we do not sprint long distance. So here's the thing. Inside of your brain, you've got a problem. It should be at walking pace for it to homeostasis to exist, for everything to be happy-go-lucky and in balance with one another. Now I've taken this chemical. It's forced the brain, it's forced the postsynaptic neuron into overdrive. I'm overstimulating that postsynaptic neuron. I'm experiencing euphoria. I'm on top of the world. I'm happy. I'm sociable. I'm all of those things that we take drugs to feel. But the brain cannot operate safely like that for very long. Eventually, something has to happen for that postsynaptic system to slow down again. If it doesn't, we're just going to destroy those neurons. Now, what should happen? We should recycle the dopamine, right? But now, the brain has a safety mechanism which comes into action. It has an enzyme which is released into the synapse. That enzyme, we'll call it a foot soldier. It goes in and it starts destroying the dopamine. So let's have a look at that on the screen. In comes our enzyme, our little foot soldier. What should be happening? We should be recycling that dopamine. What is happening? We're breaking down that dopamine. So now, as a safety precaution, there is less dopamine in the synapse. However, what's going to happen? When I need to recycle this now, I have less dopamine to park back in storage, and I have too little dopamine that is left in the synapse. But I have a double problem. Not only do I have too little dopamine left in storage and in the synapse, but that postsynaptic receptor system there is damaged. That means that the little bit of dopamine that is left there, I cannot utilize effectively because the receptor system has fried itself. The brain has actually withdrawn those receptors because it cannot afford to be overstimulated on a perpetual basis like this, and so the neuroadaptation takes place whereby the receptor system is downgraded, but now the drug wears off, so there's not that massive dopamine anymore. I have too little dopamine, and I cannot utilize the too little amount of dopamine effectively because of the damage to the receptor system. I have a problem. How do I feel now? Crash and burn, baby. I don't feel good at all. A little while ago, I was vibing. I was on top of the world. I was having a good time. I was euphoric. I was talkative. I was sociable. Now, I don't want to see anyone. I don't want to have anything to do with anyone. I'm experiencing pain. I'm experiencing dysphoria. I'm experiencing, in other words, the state where I'm not feeling good at all. I'm not just back down to normal. I am below normal. I'm experiencing depression, antisocial behavior. I don't feel like talking. It's too much effort. I have pain. I don't want to. It's diseased state, a state of dis-ease. I'm no longer at ease. I'm diseased. Well, I have a very simple solution to this. I don't like to feel this way. I wasn't built to feel this way. It's not normal to feel this way. And I will do whatever it takes to not feel this way. So what's my quick fix solution? That's right. I take more. I take more this time, but remember, I have already damaged the neurotransmitter system. I have too little dopamine, I've damaged the receptor system. So the second time I take the drug, I come up, but I don't come up as high. Because there's not enough dopamine, the receptor system is damaged. Yes, there's a change. Yes, I feel good again, but not as good. On the other hand, through this whole process repeating a second time, I break down more dopamine, the brain neuroadapts so that I have less of the receptor system working, and so when I come down the second time, I feel even lower than before. No problem. What am I going to do? I know how to fix that problem. That's right. I take more again. Third time I come up, my high is not as high as the first and the second time. Yes, I feel good, but not as good. When I come down, more dopamine has been destroyed, more of the system has been damaged, which means I feel worse than before. So over time, my highs get lower and lower, but my lows also get lower and lower. Now I'm in a vicious cycle of addiction. That's how you become an addict. I have to take my drugs eventually just to get back to the place of normality where somebody else is on a normal basis. Yes, in the beginning I got high, but over time, because of the neuro damage and the neuro adaptations that begin to take place inside of the brain as a coping mechanism and as a damage system, what happens? I'm eventually just taking drugs to get back to normal. Speak to a heroin addict about that, and they'll tell you. They take heroin just to be able to get out of bed in the morning. If they don't, their joints are on fire, their back is in pain, they're cramping, they have all sorts of problems that go wrong with them. They take the heroin just to get back to the place like you and I are when we are normal and we wake up in the morning and we are healthy and we are functioning. They just got to get back to normal. So the drug world promises you the world of pleasure. And in the end, you're a slave to the substance, because if you don't take it, well, the consequences of not taking it are even too horrific to contemplate. I just cannot even function like a normal human being. I'm not even getting high like I used to. So now I start upping my dosages, and then I eventually have to start changing my drugs. I have to move on to other drugs which use a different method of accomplishing my high, that abuse different systems, not just the dopamine system. Maybe a drug like ecstasy, which plays a lot on the serotonin system. And so we go. Or an opiate drug, which plays a lot on the endorphin system. And so I spiral out of control in this process of addiction whereby the brain, the neurochemistry becomes unbalanced. God designed for it to run on autopilot. I have turned autopilot off, and I'm trying to control those chemical balances in manual mode, and I just don't know how to do it. I can't fly this plane. And eventually I just crash into the side of the mountain and I burn up. You see, friends, playing with drugs is a very dangerous thing. It's not just a physiological thing. It's messing with your brain. It's changing the neurochemistry. And the change of the neurochemistry leads even to changes in not only functioning, but the very structure of your brain. So let's go on to the second principle here, the dopamine reuptake inhibition. And this is by way of example like the drug cocaine. Now, you know cocaine, but do you know Ritalin? Ritalin is known as methylphenidate. Methylphenidate is the drug that is administered to children with ADD or ADHD. Of course, there's other options out there. It's not the only drug, but it's one of the drugs. And I want to make a statement which I'll repeat a few times during this series. Drugs are medications, and medications are drugs. Why do I say that? The drugs that we call designer drugs that are used recreationally in the club scene and wherever just to experience a good time, they have medicinal purposes. And they certainly, if they don't now, they certainly did at one time. And the drugs that we currently call medicines, they can also have the potential to be abused recreationally. Here is a medicinal drug, methylphenidate, but it works on the same principle as the illegal designer drug called cocaine. And what is that? It stops the recycling process of the dopamine inside of the brain. So because dopamine is involved in learning and attention in a certain area of the brain, there's too little of it, or the brain's not reacting to the quantities that are there, we administer this drug which stops the recycling, builds up dopamine in the synapse, and thus the person is able to concentrate again and study again. Of course, they are also open to the risk of addiction. Now, recognizing that the difference between cocaine and methylphenidate is, of course, that Ritalin, the come-up is much more gradual. It's over a much longer time-controlled period of time, and the dosage that's given is designed not to create a high. But what you need to know is if the drug is taken in abnormal quantities, then if it's not controlled properly in terms of administration, it can be used to create highs, and it can be causing the problem of addiction in a young person's life. My message is not that you never take a medicine, but a lot of our ADD and ADHD can be boiled down to incorrect eating habits. You know, we're pumping our children full of all sorts of synthetic foods and colorings and preservatives and all sorts of chemicals which are just not natural for the brain. It causes malfunction in the brain. And we can overcome a lot of this by going back to a natural way of eating involving a large variety of plant-based foods. Anyway, that's a topic for another day and another DVD. We want to look here at how dopamine reuptake is inhibited when we take a drug like cocaine. So off we go, we take our cocaine, and now watch what happens. I'm releasing moderate amounts of dopamine into the synapse, normal firing of the postsynaptic neuron at first. I'm going to try and recycle that dopamine, and now there's something that's blocking the plug. I cannot release it. And so as the brain continues to release more dopamine and more dopamine and more dopamine, I'm building up too much dopamine in the synapse time after time, and just like our previous situation, the net effect is overstimulation of the dopamine receptors, overstimulation of the postsynaptic neuron. I feel high, I'm on top of the world, but the brain says something's wrong here, I cannot continue like this for long. So the brain sends in our enzyme, which is the little foot soldier, and he comes in and he begins to break down the dopamine, which what should be happening to it? Yes, you're quite right, it should be recycling. Now the drug is going to wear out of the system, we're going to start to recycle like normal, and then what's going to happen? I'm going to have too little in the vesicles, in storage, I'm going to have too little in the synapse. I've damaged the postsynaptic system just like previously, which means that the little bit that is there cannot be utilized effectively. So now, whereas I was feeling great a few minutes ago, I've now crashed and burned, I'm not feeling good, I'm on my downer. What am I going to do to fix the problem? I'm going to take more. What am I going to do when I'm not getting the same high? I'm going to take a higher dosage. What am I going to do when I decide that drug just isn't doing it for me anymore? I'm going to go find another drug or cocktail my drugs abusing other systems and thus begin to damage a wide network of neurotransmission inside of the brain. Now let's examine the dopamine mimicking drugs, and one of these is nicotine. Now, the actual drug that or the actual neurotransmitter that nicotine imitates is actually the acetylcholine neurotransmitter. It actually works, the way I'm going to illustrate it here with dopamine, it actually does with the acetylcholine neurotransmitter and the cholinergic neurons. But to keep it simple, here we go. Under normal circumstances, we're releasing normal amounts of dopamine. A postsynaptic neuron is not stressed, it's reacting normally, you don't have pain, you're not super elated in mood, you're able to control yourself, everything's going normally, we recycle it. Now we smoke a cigarette, in comes that nicotine, it actually binds to the same receptors as the acetylcholine, and the result is what? The result is that all of a sudden the brain thinks that it needs to be overstimulated, it reacts appropriately, it starts firing inordinately fast, it's overstimulator. Of course, the nicotine eventually works out of the system, and we go and park that acetylcholine back in the neurotransmitters like normal, and now we have a problem. I've damaged now the postsynaptic dopamine system, the postsynaptic acetylcholine system, and what happens next? Well, as the brain goes back to releasing its normal amounts of dopamine, its normal amounts of acetylcholine, it cannot utilize those chemical messengers effectively anymore, and so I'm unable to enjoy life, experience pleasure, without smoking again to force the system into action. Neuroadaptations occur, and the whole story is just like with the previous principles of action for drugs. We get ourselves into the cycle of addiction where the more I use, the more I damage the system, therefore the more I have to use, so I use more, so the more I damage the system, the more I have to use, so I use more, so I damage the system more, so I have to use more, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And so just like the hardcore drug user, like the cocaine user, the cigarette smoker was smoking 1 cigarette a day, he was smoking 2 cigarettes a day, then he's smoking 5, then 10, then 30, then 2 packs a day, and then 3 packs a day. Eventually he's a chain smoker, given enough time. Because the same chemistry is happening inside of the brain as with a hardcore drug user. Same systems are being abused, as we'll study as we go along in this whole series called Beyond Addiction. So have you ever noticed, and I certainly have noticed this as a pastor, that in times of emotional stress, people smoke more? When I have to conduct a funeral, the time when I see people smoking chain reaction, 1 cigarette after the next, you've never seen people smoke more than on funeral day outside the church. People smoke uncontrollably. Why? Why is it that a young person, before they go into that big university exam, stops to have their smoke outside the door? Why is it that when we have a breakup with a loved one or we lose someone to death, the shock of that, if we had quit smoking, sometimes people start smoking again. Or they will find that they start smoking more if they're already smoking. Well, when you understand the neurobiology of the addicted brain, it makes perfect sense. You see, dopamine is implicated in the control of mood and cognition, thought, and all of that kind of thing. When you go into a state of shock and that system needs to operate effectively to mediate mood and help you control yourself and think clearly, all of a sudden, it has been damaged in the times of ease. Are you with me? Because you're an addict, you have had to smoke even in the good times, even in the easy times. Now, you are under emotional stress. The system needs to operate even more efficiently to handle the stress, but it could not operate efficiently under normal conditions because you had damaged the system. So now when you're under stress, the system needs even more desperately to find a means of coping, and it reminds itself that when I smoke a cigarette, I feel better. When I smoke a cigarette and the acetylcholine receptors are overstimulated and releases of dopamine take place and endorphins and all the rest of it, I feel good and I can cope with life. So when I've lost a loved one, I'm going through emotional stress, I'm at a burial site of someone that I once knew, I once loved, what happens? I have to smoke all the time because if I don't, it feels like my world is going to fall apart. I can't cope. You see, that's the problem with these substances, friends. We give our control over to them in the good times, looking for a good, pleasurable experience. And then when we need the brain to function properly, it cannot function properly because we damage those systems. And now under stress, we have to use those substances more than ever before. Here's an interesting diagram on the screen. The top left-hand side is the normal brain, what we call the control brain, the brain by which we're going to measure all other brains. What you're looking at there, that colorful region in the center of the brain, symmetrical on both sides, is the nucleus accumbens. That's the middle part of this reward pathway. Lots of dopamine. In fact, the more yellow, orange, red you see there, the more dopamine is being metabolized, released and used and so on. That's the normal brain. Normally, he can experience pleasure. He can enjoy the sunlight and the fresh air, enjoy playing with his kids, and it's pleasurable. There's meaning in that for him. However, the picture on the bottom left here is the brain of the cocaine user when he's not high. So when he doesn't have his cocaine in the system to kickstart the dopamine system, what do you see? There's not even a touch of red or orange there. So he's not enjoying just playing with his kids, sitting in the sunlight, enjoying the fresh air, a walk up the mountain. He's going along thinking, why am I doing this? I don't get it. It's not fun. I'm not experiencing pleasure because that system needs to be artificially stimulated. The brain on the bottom right is the brain of the alcoholic. You can see a little touch of red. In other words, he's better off than the cocaine user. The system is not as damaged as the cocaine user, but far from the control subject, far from the ideal. And the top right-hand side is the brain of an obese person. Obesity? Adrian, what are you bringing obesity into a lecture on drugs for? Interestingly, a lot of research coming out of top addiction scientific study communities is telling us that the wrong kinds of foods can cause addiction. Huh? What? What are you talking about? Well, let me ask you this way. When last did you get home from a stressful day at work and say, oh, I'm just really, craving a bowl of Brussels sprouts? Or I'm just really craving some sun-ripened nectarines. I'm just really craving, can't live without some dates or some raisins or something like that. No. We don't go craving those things. We don't get addicted to those foods. But when we're under emotional stress, when there's a breakup, ladies, when there's something that goes wrong in our emotional lives, what do we want? We want the tub of ice cream and a spoon. We want the big cooking slab of chocolate. We want the artificial, man-made, high-fat, sugary type foods. Why? Is it just about the taste? No, it's not. Research is telling us that dopamine is released in the reward pathway. There is a neurobiological connection between the foods that we eat and the chemistry of the brain. So I crave those foods because the brain associates that sweet taste with the release of dopamine, which enables me to cope with my emotions better. So some people do with their comfort eating of the wrong types of food what other people do with their cigarettes and their nicotine. Did you get that? So appetite is something that can cause addiction. We need to bring the appetite into subjection to the higher powers of the frontal lobe, the conscious, reasoning, thought aspects of the frontal lobe. We want to move away from the synthetic, man-made, sugary, high-fat foods. We want to go over to the plant-based foods because the way foods were made in nature, they don't form cravings and they don't form addictions. Oh, you may long for a food, but that's not the same as a craving or an addiction to a food. We don't manage our emotions with eating the right kinds of food. But some people do that with artificial foods, with man-made foods. So just like cocaine and alcohol and so on, people can be eating the wrong kinds of foods, and it can cause a cycle of addiction with those junk type foods, high sugar foods, refined foods. Here is another diagram: control brain on the left and the tick brain, or the methamphetamine brain, crystal meth, on the right-hand side. Now you might think, Adrian, yes, I can see the damage there, I can see it's different, but I thought that, crystal meth has such a bad reputation. Tick has such a bad reputation. How is it that the damage is not worse? Wait a second. That brain on the right-hand side was photographed 80 days after the person was detoxed, after the person had stopped their drug use. So almost, let's round it off to 3 months, 90 days. Almost 3 months down the line, their brain still has not recovered to its pre-drug abuse state. What are we saying? We're saying that healing from addiction can be a road that we need to travel. It may take some time. The good news is there is recovery, because that crystal meth brain should look a lot worse than what it does in this picture. Are you with me? Healing does come. God is the healer. He can rewire. He can heal that brain. But healing from addiction can be a somewhat long-term journey. And we need to give the body the best advantage to overcome addiction. We'll talk about that in subsequent episodes towards the end of the series, of how we can, through the power of choice, bring into our lifestyle things which will facilitate the healing process. Almost 80 days or 90 days later, we are talking about the brain still not being completely restored. The bottom line is this. From the Journal of Human Molecular Genetics, it says this, that drug exposure of neurons results in persistent genetic alterations that affect both their architecture and their functioning. Now let's try and put that in nice and simple layman's terms. When we are taking these drug chemicals, as we've gone through these principles of how drugs work, how they alter the neurobiology, we've spoken about the neuroadaptations. All they're saying in fancy medical language is that when I take these substances and I expose my neurons, my brain nerves, to these artificial substances, when I force the brain into overdrive, when I allow chemicals to hijack the God-given systems that are there, it can not only give the sense of reward, not only does it cause the down afterwards that causes me to seek again the reward effect, but the reason the down happens is because of persistent genetic alterations. I am genetically altering the switches that come off and on in my DNA. Are you willing to take that gamble? I mean, do you know what you're doing with your genetics? Do you know how that code works? Do you know how to control that through the chemicals you're taking? Because every time you take those chemicals, that's what's happening. You are messing with the on-off switches of that complex DNA in your system. You are genetically altering not only the functioning, but the physical structure of your brain. That's what the latest research is telling us. I'm not willing to take that risk, friends. And I hope that you're not willing to take that risk. You take it off of autopilot, you take it under manual control, you mess up the genetic wiring of your system, you mess up the genetic manifestation of how those neurons form and the receptors and all the rest. And what do you have left at the end of the day? I'll tell you what you have. You have brain damage. Because the brain is not manifesting physically like it ought to according to the God-given genetic code. You've messed with that. You've changed it. Are you willing to do that to your brain? If you're not, friends, you've got to stay away from these chemicals which can so badly hurt and harm your brain, even on a genetic level. May God bless you as you make intelligent choices to stay out or to get out of the drug world, and allow the creator of your mind to recreate and rewire the brain so that it operates efficiently going forward. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, will you bless the hearer with healing? Perhaps they're carrying on their mind and their heart somebody in their family, a friend, a colleague, or whoever it is that is struggling with addiction. We would pray that you'll place a desire in their hearts, whoever this person is, that they may experience and want to experience change. May they come to you, and may you change the genetic wiring of our minds, the genetic manifestations in a physical sense. We have altered that. We have damaged the brain, and we're asking you to come in and turn the right buttons on and the wrong buttons off again. We pray that you will restore our brain, that it may be healthy and that it may be happy again, that we may experience the abundant life, the high quality life. And we thank you for answering. In Jesus' name, amen.